July 1945. World War II is nearing its end, but the Pacific remains a deadly battlefield. In these waters unfolds a story that would become one of the darkest chapters in American naval history. This is a story about a top-secret mission, a fateful encounter in the night, and 4 terrible days at sea that would determine the fate of hundreds of men. The heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis was one of the Navy's finest ships. Launched in 1931, she served as flagship of the Fifth Fleet. Her decks had been walked by admirals, presidents, and high-ranking military officials. The ship had fought in major battles across the Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands to the bloody shores of Okinawa. By the summer of 1945, Indianapolis had earned a distinguished record and carried an experienced crew of nearly 1,200 men who'd been tested by war. On July 16, 1945, the cruiser received orders unlike any she'd had before. The crew wasn't told the details, but everyone could sense this mission was different. A large wooden crate and a metal cylinder were loaded aboard under heavy security. The cargo was constantly guarded, accessible only to a handful of men with special clearance. Even the ship's commanding officer, Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III, wasn't told exactly what they were carrying. What Indianapolis actually carried would change the course of history. Hidden inside that cargo were critical components of the atomic bomb called Little Boy, the uranium fuel for the weapon that would be dropped on Hiroshima 3 weeks later. This was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the entire war. The success of the Manhattan Project depended on getting this cargo safely to Tinian Island in the Marianas. The cruiser pushed forward at full speed. In just 10 days, the ship covered the distance from San Francisco to Tinian, completing one of the fastest Pacific crossings ever recorded. On July 26th, the cargo was delivered without incident. Mission accomplished. The crew could finally relax after thousands of miles of tension. None of them imagined that their worst ordeal still lay ahead. After unloading, Indianapolis received new orders. The ship was to head for Leyte in the Philippines to prepare for Operation Olympic, the planned invasion of Japan itself. This was routine business, the kind of transit the Navy executed regularly. The cruiser would sail alone. American forces controlled these waters completely. Japanese submarines had become increasingly rare, and the war's end seemed like only a matter of time. On July 28th, Indianapolis left Guam and set course for Leyte. Aboard were all 1,196 members of her crew. They ranged from seasoned veterans who'd fought across the Pacific to young sailors on their first real assignment. There were officers carrying years of combat experience and fresh recruits who'd just finished training. Every man hoped the same thing, that the war would end soon and they'd make it home safely. Captain McVeigh was a skilled and experienced commander. He'd been in charge of Indianapolis for a year and had earned the crew's respect. Intelligence reports suggested that Japanese submarines might be operating along their route, but the information was incomplete and unclear. No one told him to take special precautions. The cruiser continued on through the warm July night, her crew unaware of what was coming. On July 30th, 1945, shortly after midnight, the Japanese submarine I-58 was patrolling the waters between Guam and Leyte under Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto. For several days, Hashimoto and his crew had been searching these waters without success. The Japanese Navy was nearly destroyed, fuel was running dangerously low, and the war was clearly lost. Still, they carried out their duty with the same discipline they'd always shown. At 12 minutes past midnight, the submarine's sonar operator picked up a contact. Hashimoto looked through the periscope. In the moonlight, he spotted the outline of a large warship, an American cruiser, zigzagging but not aggressively. For an experienced submarine commander, this was the kind of target that didn't come along often. He gave the order to prepare the torpedoes. At 12:14, the submarine launched 6 Type 95 torpedoes. 2 of them struck Indianapolis on her starboard side. The first torpedo slammed into the bow, ripping apart the fuel tanks and triggering a massive explosion. The second hit near the engine room. The blasts were devastating. The entire ship shook violently. The bow of the cruiser was virtually destroyed. Flames swept across the upper decks. The electrical systems went dead, plunging the ship into complete darkness. The radio room was badly damaged, making it nearly impossible to send out a distress call. A few radio operators managed to transmit SOS signals, but whether anyone received them remains uncertain to this day. Captain McVeigh was asleep in his cabin when the explosion hit. He rushed to the bridge immediately, but the damage was catastrophic. The bow was sinking rapidly, the stern rising higher into the air. The ship was listing more severely with each passing moment. Every system on board had failed. The official order to abandon ship was never given because the intercom system wasn't working. Most of the crew were asleep in their bunks when disaster struck. The explosions jolted them awake instantly. In total darkness, with the deck tilting at impossible angles, in corridors filled with panicked men, hundreds fought their way toward the upper decks. Some made it through. Many others became trapped in compartments already flooding with seawater. Approximately 300 men died in those first terrible minutes, never getting the chance to escape. Those who reached the deck found themselves in the middle of chaos. Life jackets were in short supply. Most of the rafts were damaged or impossible to launch. Sailors leaped into the water from dangerous heights, many sustaining injuries when they hit the surface. Some grabbed onto floating debris. Others simply swam away from the dying ship, terrified of being pulled under when she went down. Indianapolis sank with shocking speed. Just 12 minutes after the torpedoes struck, at 12:26, the cruiser slipped beneath the waves. The stern rose straight up, held that position for a brief moment, then the entire ship vanished into the black Pacific waters. In the darkness of night, approximately 900 men found themselves floating in the middle of the ocean, hundreds of miles from the nearest land. The night was warm, but for the men in the water, it seemed to stretch on forever. At first, many shouted desperately, trying to locate their shipmates in the darkness. Slowly, groups began to form. Those who had life jackets helped support those who didn't. The few life rafts that had made it into the water became gathering points where men clustered together. Officers did their best to organize the survivors, but in the pitch darkness, it proved nearly impossible. No one knew how many men were actually in the water. No one knew whether the distress signals had gotten through, but many still believed help would arrive with daylight. After all, when Indianapolis failed to arrive at her destination, someone would notice. Someone would come searching. That hope sustained many men through that endless first night. The wounded were suffering terribly. Some had broken bones, serious burns, deep cuts from shrapnel and twisted metal. Medical supplies were essentially non-existent. Only a handful of medics who'd made it into the water had any morphine. Officers worked hard to maintain discipline, urging men to stay together, conserve their energy, and keep their heads. Even so, some of the weaker swimmers were already succumbing to exhaustion in those early hours. When dawn finally broke, the grim reality became clear. The water stretched empty in every direction. Not a single ship appeared on the horizon, just endless ocean and hundreds of men struggling to survive. With the arrival of daylight, the survivors could finally assess the full scope of the disaster. They were scattered across a vast expanse of ocean. Several distinct groups had formed. The largest consisted of about 400 men clustered around a few precious rafts. Smaller groups dotted the water, some containing only a dozen men. A few sailors floated completely alone, unable to locate anyone else. The tropical sun quickly became a brutal enemy. Most men had nothing to protect their heads. The salt water burned their exposed skin relentlessly. Lips cracked and split open. Thirst became overwhelming. Warm seawater surrounded them in every direction, but drinking it meant certain death. Those who couldn't resist the temptation and swallowed mouthfuls only worsened their condition dramatically. The salt accelerated their dehydration. Officers continued working to maintain some semblance of order. They organized rotation systems so men could take brief turns resting on the rafts. They told stories, led songs, kept conversations alive. Anything to distract the men from their constant thirst and growing exhaustion. Some prayed quietly. Others thought about home, about their families, about the normal lives that seemed impossibly distant now. By the time the sun set on that first full day, it had become painfully obvious that rescue wouldn't come quickly. But morale remained relatively intact. Many still believed firmly that tomorrow would bring salvation. The American Navy controlled these waters. Patrol aircraft flew regular missions. Someone had to notice they were missing. Help had to be on its way. The second night proved significantly harder than the first. Exhaustion was accumulating in everyone's bodies. Some men were losing consciousness from sheer fatigue. Those without life jackets had to keep their legs moving constantly just to stay afloat. Even the strongest swimmers were beginning to weaken noticeably. The first deaths from dehydration and exhaustion occurred during that brutal second night. When dawn broke on the second day, a terrifying new threat emerged. Sharks. Oceanic white-tip sharks began circling the groups of survivors. These particular sharks are infamous for their aggression toward shipwreck victims. They could sense the blood from wounded men in the water, could detect weakness and vulnerability. The first attacks came at the edges of the groups. Men who were alone or had drifted away from the main clusters became the initial victims. The survivors fought back desperately. They punched the sharks, kicked them, pushed them away with whatever strength remained. Some officers organized defensive formations, ordering everyone to stay tightly grouped, to make noise, to try scaring the predators away. But the sharks kept returning, again and again. The screams of men being dragged underwater shattered whatever nerve the others had left. The terror of what lurked just beneath the surface became almost unbearable. Dehydration was intensifying dangerously. Lips swelled grotesquely and turned black. Eyes sank deep into their sockets. Some men started experiencing vivid hallucinations. They saw mirages, beautiful islands, rescue ships, containers of fresh water. Several men in their delirium began drinking the seawater, which only hastened their deaths. Others, their minds completely broken, swam away from the group, convinced that the ship was just below the surface and they simply needed to dive down to reach safety. Their friends tried desperately to stop them, but couldn't always reach them in time. By the third day, the situation had deteriorated to a critical state. Men were dying every single hour now. Initially, the survivors tried keeping the bodies nearby, saying prayers over their fallen comrades. But eventually, they had no choice but to let them drift away. The corpses attracted more sharks, creating additional danger for those still clinging to life. Officers made the agonizing decision to release the dead into the sea. Discipline was breaking down progressively. Some men had completely lost their grip on reality. They held conversations with people who weren't there, shouted incoherent phrases, laughed without any reason. The hallucinations grew increasingly vivid and complex. Men saw elaborate hotels floating on the water, Japanese warships positioned directly beneath them, entire cities submerged just below the surface. Whatever rational thinking they'd possessed was fading along with the last reserves of their physical strength. The groups continued shrinking steadily. The 400 men who'd managed to stay together on the first day had now dwindled to barely 200. Other groups suffered even more catastrophic losses. Small clusters without rafts or experienced officers to lead them virtually disappeared. Those floating in isolation stood no chance of survival. And still, impossibly, rescue failed to materialize. The sky remained stubbornly empty. The ocean stretched endlessly to the horizon, completely indifferent to human suffering. Some men were losing hope entirely. They understood with terrible clarity that if rescue didn't come today, tomorrow would be too late for most of them. Their strength was nearly exhausted. Time was running out. On August 2nd, the fourth day after the disaster, something unexpected finally happened. Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn was piloting a patrol bomber PV-1 Ventura on what should have been a routine anti-submarine patrol. His mission was to search for Japanese submarines, not to look for survivors of a disaster no one knew had occurred. At 11:25, Gwynn spotted an oil slick spreading across the ocean surface. He descended to investigate, thinking it might indicate a submarine below. As he flew closer, the pilot saw something completely unexpected. There were men in the water. Not just a few, but dozens, hundreds of men. Some were waving their arms desperately, while others simply floated motionless. Gwynn immediately radioed the coordinates and called urgently for assistance. Another aircraft, a PBY Catalina seaplane, piloted by Lieutenant Adrian Marks, arrived several hours later. Marks could see sharks actively circling the exhausted men. He made a decision that violated direct orders and could have ended his career immediately. Despite regulations explicitly forbidding landing on open water in such conditions, Marks brought his plane down onto the waves. The seaplane wasn't designed for this kind of rescue operation, but he saw no alternative. Marks and his crew began hauling men from the water as quickly as possible. They loaded the aircraft far beyond its designed capacity. When the interior was completely full, they lashed men to the wings using whatever ropes and straps they could find. In total, they pulled 56 men from the water. The seaplane was so dangerously overloaded that taking off again became impossible. It remained floating on the surface, functioning as an improvised hospital ship until proper rescue vessels could arrive. By evening, on August 2nd, the destroyers USS Cecil J. Doyle and USS Bassett, along with several other vessels, finally reached the area. Full-scale rescue operations began immediately. Men were pulled from the water using ropes, nets, and stretchers. Many survivors were so weakened they couldn't move at all on their own. Medical personnel aboard the ships worked continuously through the night, fighting desperately to save everyone who still showed signs of life. The rescue operations continued throughout the night and well into the following day. Ships methodically combed the ocean, searching for scattered groups and isolated individuals. On August 3rd, the operation was finally declared complete. Of the 1,196 men who'd been aboard Indianapolis, only 316 had survived. Approximately 300 died in the initial torpedoing and the chaotic minutes immediately after. The remaining 600 perished during those 4 horrific days in the ocean, victims of wounds, dehydration, exhaustion, shark attacks, hallucinations, and sheer despair. The Indianapolis tragedy became the single worst naval disaster in United States Navy history. The Navy immediately launched an investigation. Captain McVeigh was court-martialed, formally accused of failing to execute proper anti-submarine zigzag maneuvers and thereby exposing his ship to unnecessary risk. The charges were fundamentally unjust. Numerous officers and surviving crew members testified in his defense. The Navy even called Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander, as a witness. He testified directly that zigzagging wouldn't have made any difference. He would have successfully sunk the cruiser regardless. Despite this compelling testimony, McVeigh was found guilty, though his sentence was later reduced. The captain never recovered from what he considered an undeserved disgrace. In 1968, he took his own life. Only in 2000, decades too late, was he finally and officially exonerated. The story of USS Indianapolis remained relatively unknown for many years, overshadowed by other dramatic events of the war. But for those who survived, those 4 days in the ocean remained the most traumatic experience of their entire lives. Many carried the psychological scars until their deaths, haunted by memories of friends they couldn't save, by the screams of sharks and drowning men, by the unbearable thirst and merciless sun, by hope that faded incrementally with each passing hour. The cruiser successfully delivered the components of the weapon that ultimately ended the war. But the ship herself and the majority of her crew paid an immeasurable price for that accomplishment. Their sacrifice must never be forgotten. It stands as a sobering reminder of victory's true cost, of how fragile human life truly is, and of the fact that even in the darkest possible moments, people remain capable of demonstrating remarkable courage, of standing together, and of preserving their fundamental humanity until the very end.